Okay, so then you have the skeletal muscle. So what we have here is a muscle fiber. So we're showing like this is what they're doing and taking a big, and sometimes it's a muscle itself is called a muscle organ or muscle belly. So they're taking an entire muscle, and you see that these muscles are basically bundles and bundles and bundles of tubes. And what we have here is that this muscle fiber right here, again, muscle fiber, muscle cell, myocyte, same thing. These have a bunch of myofibrils contained within them. So again, myofibril is the smallest part when we're talking about the organization of skeletal muscle. Myofibrils are proteins, and then we have muscle fibers that can have, aka muscle cells, that have a bunch of myofibrils stacked within their contained within that cell. And then you have something surrounding each muscle fiber. It's called an endomysium, and what this is connective tissue that surrounds each individual muscle fiber. So all muscle fibers in their skeletal muscle have a layer of endomysium wrapping around it. And then what you have here is now you have all these muscle fibers that have myofibers or myofibrils within them. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 muscle fibers within this muscle fascicle. So just like how a muscle cell has a bunch of myofibrils, a muscle fascicle has a bunch of muscle fibers or muscle cells. So each of these cross section is one muscle cell right here. So when you have a bunch of these muscle fibers together, you have something called a fascicle. So bundle of fibers is a fascicle, and then you have something called a perimysium. Now this one is where peri typically means something surrounding something, but that's the thing is like you already have the endomysium, you have a perimysium, and then you have another layer. The perimysium covers each individual muscle fascicle. So that's what we have there. So again, more connective tissue that surrounds a bundle of a bundle of a bundle. And then you have muscle fascicles, and then you have the entire muscle organ, sometimes called muscle belly. I think, especially things like kinesiology, I hear that muscle belly term, or physical therapy. They like using that term muscle belly. So that's what they're referring to, not necessarily the muscles in your belly or stomach region. They're just talking about the entire muscle itself. So then you have a bunch of muscle fascicles, and they make an entire muscle, and that's or an organ, and that's what we have here. And now remember that endo means inner. Now the opposite of endo, that prefix endo mean inner or within, is epi. So epi, just like you have your epidermis or your epigastric. And so what you have here is the outermost layer cut surrounding each muscle or organ slash muscle belly. That's what you call the epimysium. All right, so then again, myofibrils. Again, you have all these myofibrils, whatever. So the thing is that myofibrils, these are the smallest. Then you have your myofibers or muscle fibers, muscle cells. Again, synonymous. And then you have muscle fascicles. So again, then the fascicles, so within each muscle fiber, you have a bunch of myofibrils. Within each muscle fascicles, you have a bunch of muscle fibers. And then when you have a grouping of muscle fascicles, you get an entire muscle organ. Actually, if you have the anatomy coloring book, the Captain Elson one, I think has a better picture of this, but I'm not showing it for copyright reasons. Okay, so then the thing is that you have bundles upon bundles upon bundles. Your skeletal muscles are basically bundles of cells. And then what we have here is not only is it bundles of bundles, but you also have connective tissue to kind of keep everything together as well. So without surrounding every individual myofiber, you have an endomysium. And then surrounding each muscle fascicle, you have a perimysium. And surrounding each muscle belly or entire muscle, you have an epimysium. So this is going from smallest to biggest. So if we talk about levels of organization, if we're going from the biggest to the smallest, again, when you have entire muscle or a muscle belly, then it's made out of a bunch of fascicles put together. An individual fascicle is made out of a bunch of muscle fibers, aka muscle cells. And within each muscle cell, you have a bunch of myofibrils, and these are proteins. And this is going from biggest to smallest. So again, you build each of these by having a bunch of these in each cell or each level. And then you have an epimysium surrounding each muscle belly, and then you have a perimysium surrounding each muscle fascicle. So again, peri usually refers to the outer layer of something surrounding something, but in this case, it's actually a middle layer. And then you have endomysium. Again, epi is outer, endo is inner when you're talking in general. So the endomysium is the innermost layer of connective tissue surrounding each myofiber. Okay, so now this is another thing about muscle cells. When you're looking at, again, muscle cells, myocytes, myofibers, again, in terms of the skeletal muscles or skeletal muscle, pretty much the same thing. Now, within cells in general, remember all the way back to chapter 3 with organelles and different parts of a cell. So there are special terms that are exclusively refer to, or special terms for parts of the cells that are exclusively used in reference to muscle cell organelles and parts. So the cell membrane, we know the plasma membrane in our surrounding each cell, but in muscle cells, there's a special term for it called the sarcolemma. I know it's like, it sounds like if you see this for the first time, you're like, wait, what's the lemma? So the thing is that it's just a fancy name for the cell membrane of a muscle cell. So when you hear that term sarcolemma, it's just referring to the plasma membrane of a muscle cell. And then with cytoplasm, they have a special term called sarcoplasm. So when you hear terms like sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, it's referring to the growth of the cytoplasm within a muscle cell. So notice that sarco is also, in addition to myo, is often used as a prefix or a root word referring to muscles. And then the endoplasmic reticulum, remember this is the site of all the protein synthesis and also like lipid synthesis in regular cells. It's actually a little more specialized in muscle cells, so this is where you should definitely know the special name for organelle in the muscle cell. So when you hear this term sarcoplasmic reticulum, yeah, it's not just like any old endoplasmic reticulum. It actually has a very important function we're going to cover in this lecture, but behaves differently. It's arranged differently than your typical endoplasmic reticulum in a regular non-muscle cell. And then there's something called, again, we know what's the powerhouse of the cell? Mitochondria, right? So mitochondria, we know what that looks like in a cell. We know it generates ATP. In muscle cells, so the thing about muscle cells, they're very active. They need a lot of energy. So sometimes you might see this term called sarcosome. So sarcosome is what we have with this. So sarcosome is just a special term. So you would think they would call it sarcochondrion, but instead they just call it a sarcosome. And then nucleus we have here. So the nucleus we have, so what's a nucleus of a muscle cell called? Thankfully, they don't give it a special sarco name, so they call it just the nucleus. I know.